So welcome everybody to our third atelier. We call these things ateliers. We principally have three different types of events, perhaps a few others that we do as experiments. But one type is premieres, where we surface new research and new insights that we've just got, and we share it with our members first before anybody else. One type is salon conversations, and we're having one of those next week, where it's really about perfecting our craft, having conversation and connecting as a community. There's no artifact that we present and kind of build out of those things. And in this case, we've now done two, and this will be our third. We call these ateliers, French word for workshop or lab, kind of rooted in the 17th century. I see some French people online, so you can probably debate my pronunciation of atelier, but we not only want to have a really good conversation and surface kind of something that we thought was really important, and all of these have been voted on as being the most important topics we wanted to cover off in the Guild, but we want to produce something as well. So if you're intrigued by anything that you hear today, we'd love for people to author kind of a 500-word kind of treatise on what's happening in their part of the world and how they're experiencing the pandemic in 2020-21. So as the title goes, we are calling this Around the World Sensemaking, and I think this was our third or fourth most popular atelier asked for. And I think people had the sense of, look, we get together, a lot of times it's Western world, a lot of times it's Canada, just because that's where myself and Rob, the founders, are from. Andrea is from the US, so a lot of it's North American centric. We have to get out of our four corners and actually get out to a much broader world and try to sense how people are experiencing this pandemic and the world differently. And so that was kind of our mission for wanting to host this today. We'll put this on YouTube later, and let's see if it can advance slides. So just so everybody knows, we've done two of these. So our cadence is about once a month to do ateliers. And if you want to see where any of these are going on, I think we've got things scheduled out. I'm not too sure if they're on our schedule yet, but we do have a grayswanguild.org /calendar that tells you every single event that's happening inside the Guild. We did two in May called Resilience. Such a good topic. We did two. One was presented by Louise, who's actually online today joining us, and one was presented by Samantha Yarwood. And so it was really interesting to have one topic, two different times a day, two different audiences, global audiences, and two different complete takes on the topic, which was interesting. And then we did something last month where we got this really interesting group of people. There was about 12 or 13 of us that have now decided. We did the event called Here to Stay or Going Away. We've now pivoted to, okay, let's do 20 different essays or articles about, is what we've experienced in the pandemic here to stay, or is it going away to something that might look a little bit closer to 2019? So on this topic today, it's funny, in the Guild, we were born out of the pandemic. 15 months ago, things came to a stop in North America, and we said, we need to do something about this. Well, as you can see by this chart, it's not exactly waning as a topic. And as we'll explore today, I think in different parts of the world, it's either we've seen the light at the end of the tunnel, or it's, still a huge consideration. But, net as an average, it's certainly gone down in people's kind of frontal lobe. And then other things have climbed. I think the poverty and social inequality piece is a really interesting one to look for. I could see that one breaking high. But this has not been a uniform experience around the planet. We're going to get into a discussion today. So this is really just the preamble for a discussion. We want to have this, to use a soccer or European football term, we want to have this discussion in two different parts, both the cultural impact and the emotional impact of what we've gone through. So I built 7 charts just to tell you just how different this last 15 months, maybe 18 months, maybe 12 months, depending on your part of the world, has been experienced differently. And so with no further ado, vaccination rates. I'm only small proud of the fact that Canada just inched past Israel yesterday in terms of vaccination rates. So 64% of Canadians have at least one dose. And you see a number of countries in the 60s, so that's a really good sign. You've got a middle set of countries, mainly Europe, United States as well, fall into this middle camp where they're climbing, but they're hitting vaccine plateaus. And then for a variety of different reasons, you have a number of countries that have not crossed the quarter threshold yet. I think some of these could be characterized as mismanagement. Some of these could be characterized as, well, it's probably not a pressing priority because hardly any of us have it. And part of this might be access to vaccines and just poverty in general. So as you look at this range, you start to realize, wow, no wonder people are experiencing the world differently given, you know, their level of vaccine. And I know G7 is talking this week about how much the G7 countries want to share with the world. So should be interesting times. In terms of COVID deaths, it's interesting how math changes things. Peru was not reflecting fully COVID deaths, and in one day turned from like a top 10 country into the #1 country in the world. This is not probably a status that you want to have, but Peru, Hungary, Brazil, extraordinarily high deaths per 100K population. I mean, think about that. In Peru, 575 people out of every 100,000 people died. Just staggering. If you look at mainly Europe, you've got kind of more of a middling group of people. And then it was interesting as I looked at Africa and Asia and certainly the Oceania countries, very, very few deaths per 100,000 people. And so I do think we'll write about this pandemic 5 to 10 years from now as a failure of being able to sense make and plan in certain countries, and in other countries probably a much better job at doing that. 5 more charts. You perceive the pandemic situation is getting better globally. So this is not in my neck of the woods, but in other parts of the world, it's probably getting better. India, Spain, and Philippines have all said, yep. You know, majority of them think it's getting better. Denmark, Vietnam, and Finland say, I don't know. And it's interesting. A lot of those countries haven't experienced the pandemic fully themselves, like they've been on the good side of some of the death rates of countries. And so it's probably thinking, you know what, the rest of the world doesn't have their act together, at least we do. In fact, the Finnish, something like 85% of Finnish have said, yeah, pandemic, really don't notice a difference. And candidly, some of us are probably happier that we're living our lives the way we do. So interesting on that front. And then United Kingdom, Singapore, Thailand definitely are in the camp of, God, you know, the world is not getting better globally. So interest in getting the vaccine, and this is where international travel and being able to have supply chains that are secure, interesting. You know, not surprisingly in Brazil, China, Mexico, and UK, very, very high in terms of majority of the population saying, I want it. Germany, France, Japan, South Africa, middling countries, majority, but still not to the point where you want to. And then France and Russia, I don't know if anybody from Russia is joining us here today, but they only polled big countries, but Russia was conspicuous by such a small amount of population saying they're interested in getting the vaccine. So put in chat if you have any insight into the Russian situation.
12%, Sean, of vaccine coverage in Russia right now, to the G7 average of over 60%.
I get the vaccine, Rob. I'm curious in terms of the public opinion, in terms of I don't want to get it. Is it a distrust thing? Is it a I'm not too sure.
Yeah, the coverage on when I look at infodemics and misinformation, the rates out of Russian media is very high, and that's very influential, as we know, in all the studies that happened in other areas. If you have a press that says vaccinations are dangerous or worrisome, you have a public that feels the same way. It reflects quite evenly there. So it's a big problem.
Interesting. All right, I've only got 3 more charts here. So for the right-brained of you in the world, I should have probably put more headlines and pages on, but we'll get to discussion very shortly. This is coronavirus as a concern rising or falling? And I tend to do these pretty quickly on the day of Ateliers, so apologize on the little spelling Easter egg there. India, Malaysia, Japan, Canada saying, wow, you know what? Contrary to popular belief, you know, I think the world average is about -3 on this question. We are actually having more concerns about this pandemic and coronavirus than we did even last month. Conversely, Poland, UK, Germany, and pretty much nearly every country in Europe is saying, yeah, this is feeling like we're getting to the end of this. So we're a little bit less concerned about it. we are heading in the right direction as a country, which certainly factors in a lot of different things. But given what I just shared about the pandemic being the primary cause in each country, if you're in Colombia, Peru, South Africa, Brazil, you probably got some real key concerns in terms of where you're going. Turkey, Israel, Sweden, there's still quite a bit of negativity. And US, Canada, Australia, and Saudi Arabia have certainly, Saudi Arabia is way off the map in terms of just kind of being 2 standard deviations away from the norm in terms of being really positive in terms of the right direction their country is going. So, and then finally, we don't talk politics, but certainly we need to navigate politics inside the guild. And I didn't pick on any leaders here. I looked for some of the leaders that were really popping. I will make special mention of Jacinda from New Zealand, who by all means has come out of this pandemic looking like a really strong steward of her state. Seems like Modi, Morrison, Merkel, and Biden have had a bit of spring in their step recently. Johnson and Trudeau have probably had a few dents in their image, and Bolsonaro, Macron, and Sula have certainly had some grievances aired at their doorstep in terms of their management of both the pandemic, but also just in general where their country's headed. Number 1 on this list, strangely enough, was the Italian new prime minister. So I guess anybody that's new gets a real good honeymoon grace period for any handling of either the economy or the pandemic. So anyway, that felt like maybe a lot of just downloading information, but I thought we would at least present facts and information before we got into the actual discussion itself. And so, we want to tackle this in 2 parts. And I don't care where you are in the world, but we would love to understand the pandemic, but also just everything around the pandemic in the last years. What has been the cultural impact of this pandemic in your part of the world? We're really curious about that. And as well, we think there's an emotional octave range here too, in terms of regardless of what the cultural impact is, how have you personally experienced this and being emotionally either, reappraised your world or kind of definitely being harmed by the fact that we've had quarantining and other things. So I'm going to go off camera now. Hopefully we'll see each other. And let's make this into a discussion. On the question of what has been our cultural impact in whatever countries we've been in, anybody want to jump into the void to begin our conversation on this? And Dave, I see that you've joined us early morning from Pacific. Dave was quite helpful in terms of instructing the challenges that we want to go through here. Anybody want to jump into the cultural void that we've created?
Still not hearing you, guys.
Oh, geez. You got audio, Dave? Sorry. Dave, check. Sound check.
Yeah. 1 2 1 2. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, so Geese, please. I'm sure I'm butchering your name and I'll apologize. What you get when you do a global event, right? So apologies from the get-go.
Oh, you're muted. You're muted too as well.
Unmuted, so great. So I have 2 mutes. Right, Gijs is my name. So I'm not sure, Sean, if it's part of your framing on culture is in terms of how does culture impact COVID versus the impact of COVID on culture. So, and even on the survey results that you've just shown is, I'm intrigued by sometimes the cultural impact. I've lived in the Middle East, where you should be positive around, I would say, the ruling class or whoever's in the country. So I think definitely that can impact positive sentiment versus I'm living in South Africa and I know we're well known as a country doing our dirty washing out in the open. So it looks intense, it looks bad, and to some extent it sometimes reflects the reality. And I think some of the negative data I've seen around South Africa, it relates yes, I think getting access to vaccines. So I think a lot of countries in Africa were scrambling to get vaccines while it was actually taken up by more wealthier states. And I think actually getting only now to a space where there's actually a supply of vaccines. So I think definitely that impacts also a bit of the slow end in terms of implementation. And I'm also sure in terms of just underreporting. So I think testing is well done, I think, within South Africa with a lot of medical infrastructure. But if you go wider, I think that might definitely impact the reported rates. So I'm stand a bit skeptical around some of these percentages.
You, beyond just the experience of South Africa itself, you brought up a really interesting point, like how much of our culture has been affected by the pandemic versus how much has the pandemic affected our culture. Well, I guess maybe I'll answer a question with a question. What do you think on that front? Where is the balance?
Yeah, I guess it goes both ways. So I think in terms of currently just interesting things like national culture or behaviorally, it's been immense. If I've seen South Africa, where a thing like a funeral is a big cultural tradition, where you have masses of people gathering together, and you actually had ministers explaining on national television the importance of changes and going into really detail. It became almost like a national education theme in terms of actually saying to people what's the importance of not, for example, coming in at night and being together. They would call it in South Africa night vigil, where people get together and be there to support the grieving family. And so it is cultural practices, and suddenly you have people that can't get together anymore. You have so your funerals is much smaller. I think we've all even experienced it globally. I think any other gatherings have changed, and I think just in terms of distancing. So I think just how difficult it was, social distances. I would call it almost your bubble in which you operate as a person. There's close proximity. It wasn't the issue, I think, in Africa, India, and I think that also has an impact in transmission in certain instances, but a lot of education also helped around lessening that impact.
I really interesting perspective, particularly halfway around the world from Canada. Just appreciate that. It's interesting from a cultural standpoint. I remember Ipsos came out with a survey, probably April 2020, where pretty much none of us knew what was going on pandemic wise, and we didn't know if we were going to have 0 cases or a lot of cases. And it was so interesting how negative or positive countries were, which probably expresses the fact that culture is really important heading into something. Like the Philippines kind of pretty much said, we know we're kind of pooched on this one. We don't have structures or systems. It's going to be horrible. And yet they're the most positive country around the world in terms of their disposition around the pandemic. Meanwhile, in Japan, where there's probably a little bit more structure around knowing what was going on and maybe some of the systems in place, they were the most negative country around the world. So maybe in support of culture, maybe having a bigger impact than pandemic on us. Just there's some hard wiring, I think, in some of our societies that maybe get the better of us. I'd love to pivot to somebody else to come in on our topic about culture. We've got people from around the world here. So anybody feel comfortable jumping in? And if you're muted, because I think I might have just tried to hear somebody there.
Not entirely sure it qualifies as a culture, but the thing I'm really noticing is folks making home a nicer place to be, which was kind of well known, at least in the US during the peak of things, that everybody who could seemed to be doing home improvement projects to make the home office, the recreation places, the fitness room, and what I'm seeing as I run around town is a lot of new patios. with the string of lights and the new furniture, and it just looks like a lovely place to spend an afternoon or an evening with friends. And it kind of, as I've been concerned about things coming back, I've had the same thoughts of, you know what, I have a nice home, I have a nice yard, and I should really do what I can to make it a nice place to be. And as I go around my little corner of the universe, I see what evidence of seems like a lot of people thinking the same thing. Obviously, it's limited to people who own a home and have the space and have the budget to do these improvements, but there are a lot of new patios.
And just as Nathan, that's amazing. And I know we've done a little bit of a deeper exploration on the post-pandemic home, right? How much of that behavior will continue even after the first specter of this. Can you just mention as well where you're calling in from, so people have a perspective on?
So I'm in the Southeast United States, in North Carolina, fairly upscale suburb of a tech hub. So there's plenty of money around here. And obviously this is homeowners in suburban neighborhoods.
Wonderful. Well, thanks for sharing that. And just based on your bookcase alone, it looks like the home looks really good. So
this is the office. The library is downstairs.
One of the few times in my life I actually hit the timing just correctly. We redid our backyard the summer before everything went to hell, and so last summer I had my backyard was perfect, ready for cocooning and never leaving. So we're definitely seeing the same thing here in Toronto, and seeing copycats of, lots of, like you say, the lights going up in different people's backyards, and people, spending time more alone than anything else in their backyards, but a lot of additional work going in. And we also, is related, we redid our kitchen this past year, sort of during the pandemic, which is certainly a challenge when half your house is closed off and you've got plastic sheeting up and other pieces. But when you look at the availability of people to do some of that work, it was crazy how in demand all these people are, and how challenging it is. And you run into contractor difficulties and timelines in the best case scenarios. Right now, you don't know what's going to happen. It's unpredictable with contractors in the first place, but in these latest times, and it's interesting, the interactions as you hear how different clients they have are reacting. People that normally just get a little bit frustrated with them seem to just go off the rails, it would seem, when problems arise. And other people who are, more understanding and sympathetic and maybe just aware of the challenges certainly have the patience to deal with them. So it's almost like the extremes were just expanded dramatically on the way people, and maybe this goes back to sort of the culture reference, the way people are reacting to the current situation almost puts a magnifying glass on strengths and weaknesses of different individuals, and how they respond to challenging situations, how long their fuses are before they explode, and things like that. It's been interesting to see.
I'm going to get back to you later on, James, when we talk about the emotional impact of this, because I'm really curious if people are sensing a different emotional octave from maybe last year to now. Like, certainly I am, but I'd be curious if others are experiencing that too. Anybody else want to weigh in on what has been the cultural impact of what we've experienced the last 2 years?
Yeah, I'm Joseph from Mauritius. So here in Mauritius, the biggest industry used to be finance and tourism, and we're highly dependent on international, like foreign tourists coming in. And since the pandemic, like most of the hotels and hotel chains went bankrupt. And the ones which survived, they decided to boost domestic tourism. So what you're seeing nowadays is you have a lot of locals having, the day packages, like utilizing day packages and weekend packages. And there's, which would have been like 5-star, super expensive hotels for honeymoons for foreigners. So we have a lot of that happening right now. And, the other new thing is we have hotels rebranding to become like business parks with apartment complexes within the same, like park. So you have a lot of even locals who are now opting to that kind of lifestyle, because we have like, a lot of lockdowns. Even they say we had a new lockdown. So locals opt to now rather than renting a normal place, they rent in a hotel, like a former hotel, which is now a business park with, you know, the apartment and the other facilities, which is nice. But in other parts of Africa, because I have a network of mappers, like data collectors across Africa, so I get a lot of information from different parts. In other parts of Africa, the issue is people who travel. So for instance, in Tanzania, right? So Tanzania didn't have any testing or vaccine rollout. They just had one last week. They started getting vaccines last week. So, but then they had, you know, the borders were open. So people would travel to China and India and all those places. So people who were traveling were concerned that the then government didn't provide like the possibility for them to access vaccines or you know, any, you know, serious testing. Because, you know, the then president, who is now passed, was super against this, and, you know, the 99% of Tanzanians don't travel, so it didn't make any sense for them to have vaccines. But now it's now starting to change, and, you know, people are open to it, and you have people who, you know, like the current government is saying, you know, those who want to get vaccines should have the, you know, the possibility of getting them, and those who don't, you know, it's not forced. The same thing is happening in Uganda, where you know, testing is, you know, about $65 for the normal test and $150 for the express one. But then a normal Ugandan, of course, can't afford that. And so the government is actually not, like, even when you go to a doctor, if you're feeling feverish and it's not like a cold or any of these malaria or normal diseases, doctors don't recommend for COVID testing. Of course, they know people can't afford it, so it's not being pushed. So you have a lot of deaths happening. I saw someone saying they're not reported. Yes, you have a lot of deaths happening in these parts, especially in East Africa, and people are just either, you know, they're taking it as, you know, assume it's a cold, or assume it's a normal disease that people are, and it's mostly, you know, people who do business. Travel to get, you know, the businesses from Asia and the likes, and people in politics who travel a lot. But and the general sentiment is it's difficult to get public support because most of the public like doesn't travel, so they don't care. And the sentiment, like the general sentiment is, yeah, at least we get to reduce the top 1% in that, you know, that country, which is not very positive, but you know, that's what governments have to deal with. And yeah, let's hope that in the next year also we can have option of vaccines, you know.
I'm not an expert on the Mauritius political situation. Was your government voted out, or was that just a natural passage to somebody else?
No, in Mauritius is stable. We have a new government since 2019. During, you know, COVID, Mauritius is very, you know, it's more developed than normal African countries. So, you know, you had, you know, paychecks for everyone and all those things. However, the locals, you know, they feel that the government is using that as a way to, you know, to steal money, you know, like in that process of, you know, handing out help and all that, they're using that to embezzle public funds. But most of the claims haven't been substantiated yet. On my side, you know, as a person who runs a business, it's very good because the government has now been squeezed, so they have digitized a lot of processes, so everything is faster. You know, now most of the meetings can be done remotely, and things run smoothly. And now the government is under more pressure to boost the economy back up, because, you know, we had huge inflation and all this. So we're trying to the government is working hard with the private sector to get everything back to normal faster, and to have other industries to now no longer rely on tourism, but boost other industries, mainly the tech industry with fintech at the lead of it. So from my side, it's perfect. And in the rest of Africa, it's not the same, but, you know, in some countries like Tanzania now, with the new government, they're making some good progress on adjusting.
Wonderful. Joseph, like, really interesting perspective. I oftentimes go like completely different other side of the world, what's going on. So thank you. Anybody else want to weigh in from their particular part of the world on? Bruce, I see your hand up.
Yeah, if I may share, I'm from the southern tip of South Africa, beautiful city of Cape Town. And just looking from an entrepreneurial culture, because that's the place that I'm looking at. I think one of the things that we were able to do, we were able to get people online really, really fast. A week before we went into the firm lockdown, we kind of started a daily group of people that met. And I think over last year, we were close on 100,000 people that we trained to use Zoom just to be able to leverage what they had into the online environment. And I think that cultural change that we've seen is definitely something that people's perspective has changed from being a local business. And even in, I'm just learning my local community, all of a sudden, overnight, you are able to become a global entity, and you're able to compete equally with some of the big people, and you can move faster than the big people. So the advantages of that was able to take advantage of a few people. And, the percentages are small, unfortunately. There's a couple of people that have done very, very well. And speaking to some of the folks that I'm interacting with around the world, they're saying that the last year has been their best year ever in business, where other people are still sitting at home waiting for a government handout and saying, I'm a victim to the circumstances, you need to pay for me. So and I think that that realization of a paradigm shift, and I think a lot of people, and I feel for people, and I know circumstances are there at hard, but there are certain people that have become victims because they have become self-victims to the circumstances. And there's a whole lot of other people. I was speaking to the, I think it was the Ferrari franchise owner here in Cape Town, and he said he sold more cars in this last year than he has done in the last 5 years. And of course, coming from Africa, one smack, corruption. But it's actually, there's a small percentage of that, because there's a huge trucks of money that have been lost in our environment because of that. But there are some people that are doing very, very well because they haven't become victims to circumstances. They've risen above that and saying, I am not going to wait for government to rescue me. I'm going to go out and do that, put my business online, get a global market, and leverage that. And I think that's a mentality skill that a lot of people, it's not something you teach at school. It's just something that you learn through entrepreneurship and having the right people around you and stuff. And I think the other rise thing that we've seen is the rise of these kind of groups of people that get together, call them masterminds, or, think tanks, or whatever it is, like this one. And
or perhaps a guild, maybe, Bruce.
A guild, yeah, just something and stuff. So I belong to, 3 that every week I go to 3 different groups, and it's 4 different purposes, and that support and that mindset and that accountability and pushing that envelope is absolute. So, hats off to you guys. I think you're absolutely brilliant by just being able to push that envelope right off the table and say, there's opportunity, not victim mentality.
Bruce, thank you for that. I mean, the more you talk about just on this front, but then I globalize it to everything. I mean, this pandemic really is 2 solitudes, isn't it? Like just 2 different, and probably many different, but like you're painting a picture of definitely 2 different ways business and entrepreneurs have approached this. And I see this 2 solitudes thing across a raft of different things. We're going to have our South African tag team here because Louise Mowbray is coming in as well. Saw your hand up.
I am. I wanted to wade in, Bruce.
She's probably been one of those Ferrari purchasers from your Cape Town dealership, perhaps. But,
well, I was laughing because I guess my deep interest lies between the UK and South Africa, kind of spanning the two, and very much involved in both. And one thing I learned the other day, a friend who's head of forestry South Africa, so one of the essential services in South Africa. So we get to hear some of the interesting things that are going on from a perhaps slightly more informed basis on our almost daily walks. Was telling us that every Lamborghini driver in South Africa is being investigated because the taxman has figured it's the best way of discovering whether any of that money is legit, because most of the flashy money here is not. unlike the Middle East, where, of course, you'd have 20 in a garage in London, probably just for the summer, which is a whole different situation, having lived and worked in the Middle East as well. Case. But I love what you said, Joseph, about that opening up and digitizing of things, because that's one thing that Africa has really suffered from, is the availability of digital services and the costs of them. So for the average citizen, you know, I've always said, give a 1-year-old an iPhone and you will leapfrog any government program on trying to digitize the world, digitize Africa. You know, just give people internet access. I think it was the head of, was it Motorola or one of the big, I forget, it was a telecoms provider who originally said all of Africa should have internet access. You know, it's a requirement of all democracies. And, you know, I agree, you know, give every kid, and many big companies have thrown laptops and iPads and tablets at millions of children and schoolgoers in Africa, but they haven't given them electricity and they haven't given them internet access. And that's our biggest issue. So Bruce, when we talk about that wherewithal and that entrepreneurial spirit, I think Africans have it in bucket loads. We are resilient. We find ways of getting stuff done. We string electrical wires from one place and split it into 5,000 across a township. And if you don't know that, come and walk a township with myself and any one of my American friends who ever arrives for a little bit of a tour. It's very interesting. We are immensely resourceful. Saying that, without education, without access to the internet, we have almost got a neurological divide. And the chap who won Thinkers 52 years ago, Rob Tapscott, who wrote Blockchain Revolution with his son, his previous book detailed how his foundation had spent, I think at the time, 15 years ago, $5 million at looking at the neural pathways in young people who had grown up on devices and those young people who hadn't, or those older folks like the sort of 50, the C-suite, who perhaps were struggling with getting millennials to do some work. You know? So when we look at this divide, it further divides. That's my concern for Africa. Not so much the wherewithal to get up and do it, but the tools to be able to do that. And that is deep and it's intrinsic, and it needs, without doubt, it needs people like us to actually get on with it and do something about it. So I'll leave it at that, but loving this conversation. Thank you.
A lot of nodding heads from your African colleagues. I think if you're running for office, Joseph and Bruce might vote for you there, Louise.
Well, Joseph and I know the story well. It's along with everybody else. So yeah.
I wanted to pivot to Francisca, if you're comfortable. I've been noticing in the chat, Francisco is almost a global citizen of the world, at least by cousinry. So just maybe where you're calling in from and the cultural impact that you've experienced on the pandemic.
Yeah, so I'm based in Ardsley, New York, aka the Westchester, although I hate saying that. It's a small village of like 5,000, but I'm originally from Montreal, Canada, and my parents are still there. My younger sister's there, my younger brother's in Toronto, Canada, my older sister's in Melbourne, and I have a grandmother in Lima, Peru, and we do family Zooms every Friday at 6, and so it's been really interesting for the last 16 months to talk to each one of them and get a state of play, you know, like from being worried that my 97-year-old grandmother in Lima wouldn't be able to get vaccinated because, you know, it's a different scenario there than it's been here in the US, where it was looking really precarious, but then, you know, vaccines started to like fall out of shelves and into our arms. And so we've been really lucky. And then hearing from my parents complaining about Trudeau and how slow the vaccination train has been there. And then watching my sister in Melbourne, where it's been, you know, lockdown out. And then I see her out, no masks on the beach. And I'm like, wait a minute, COVID's still there. So what's up with the no masks? And, you know, she was explaining to me even a week ago that it's no longer communal spread, but now they're calling it fleeting, because you could pass people in a store and catch it. And I said, well, here's my question. Are people wearing masks? And she said, well, no, not really. And I was like, well, that's called just COVID transmission. So it's been really interesting to track. And I'm, I work at an architecture practice that has, offices around the world and headquarters in Sydney. And so watching my colleagues going into the office and in Asia as well has been really interesting, because it has appeared more normal than it has here. But, I know appearances aren't everything. And I'm really, I guess, fascinated by what's going to happen with the workplace and the return to the workplace, because it just seems like a bomb that might go off, from Jamie Dimon declaring like everyone shall return to the office, kind of as someone said to me the other day, Marie Antoinette, a little bit maybe culturally misaligned with the times and how people are feeling, to other organizations saying, we're going to keep it hybrid. And I have a neighbor, as we've all become so close to our neighbors, who works in HR at a large financial institution. And she was saying, oh, it's kind of messy, because we're facilitating these roundtables, asking employees how they feel, and they're expressing anxiety about the return. She's like, but ultimately I know the CEO wants everyone to come back. And my husband works at, a tech company, which I shall not name, which originally he's trained he's an agile coach and facilitator. And he was invited in to be part of a roundtable to talk about, okay, so what does work look like now? And if we do come to the office, for what purposes? And then he told me just like this week, he got an email from the head of HR saying, everyone shall return to the office in September when we open our doors. So I'm just curious to see, like what the fallout is. And I think, sorry, most of my examples are companies based in the US that are kind of like, taking strong positions. And so I'm not saying that it's the same everywhere else, but I just feel like, people have had a lot of time to learn how to work remotely and to skip that, 2 to 3 hour daily commute, and have a bit more quality time at home. And so I do wonder, like, will people vote with their feet? Will people, as has come up already, and I've heard this too, that entrepreneurs have had a tremendous year. I think I saw someone the other day saying like she's got 3 businesses now and they're all doing really well. So I wonder what's going to happen, because I do think the workplace, the workforce, or whatever you want to call it, has changed, when we cannot go back. I never believe that I think it's a bad idea. I think it's a bad idea to go backwards when we've gone through such a huge evolution and shift, and to ignore that, I guess I think it's at your own peril.
Covered a lot of really interesting things of the gamut of cultural impact there, Francisca. I'll cue you up as well. We have an August atelier coming that's all about future of work mastery. So definitely want to have you part of that from a number of different standpoints. I think it's the number one thing that we surfaced from one of our research surveys of 65 potential long-term impacts. Future of work and how we work and where we work is probably the biggest. Agustin, nickname Bora, from my cousin from Uruguay. We need a South American perspective on this. The South Africans have just completely, and Africans, sorry, Joseph, I'm going to take the whole continent. They've dominated our discussion today. We need a South American perspective.
There was something Bruce was saying that I stay connecting with when he was talking about, I thought about UBI, Universal Basic Income, and how the African pilots programs that they're being held there for a few years now, how we're working, and how can we bring and connect with UBI in Latin America. And of course, Uruguay for me is like a case because we are a small country, but we are like software exporters. So sometimes services and people are coming here as Google, big companies establishing, but what will happen with people covering their needs. And this is a COVID situation, like, right? So what Bruce was saying, that is like, people can complain that I'm this bad because of an external factor. Please give me my allowance of 1,200 a month and I will survive, something like that, right? So Uruguay now is being vaccinated. If we are 3 million, we get already 3 million doses around people. So some have their 2 shots, other ones, as I have my first shot. And I was coming, seeing someone that I was coming on a car for the first 15 or 20 minutes, and she was getting her second dose like today, and I will get my second dose in like 2 weeks with the Chinese one. And so people here had the availability we were on a lottery, and it was like a age range, and some of the elder get the Johnson & Johnson, and some of the younger ones as us get the Chinese solution. You cannot like pick. And I'm talking with people on Argentina, and they are complaining because they got the Sputnik one, the Russian one, and they don't want to get that one. And they also don't want to get the Chinese one, or whichever one, or some said AstraZeneca or whatever. It's crazy how you can talk to people, Brazil, Chile, Argentina, Uruguay. We are all like there, like together, and everyone is doing worse than the other one. Uruguay was the weirdest case, that for the first year we were like flat. We had like 100 deaths and 5,000 maximum, and today we have like 4,000 daily, which is like, so we spike exponentially. And we are trying to contrast that with vaccination, which is like, but so perspective from here is like how the world is doing when travel is going back, because Uruguay was the first green door that opened in the middle of a red like pandemic style the first time, and now our borders are kind of not closed. We can travel, but when you come back, you always have to get that negative test and whatever, and get 14 days of quarantine. But we want to travel back soon again.
It's so interesting. I've heard about general practitioners from pretty much around the world. Nobody has cared whatever medicine has been given out to them, whatever brand. It's like, all right, if that makes sense. This is like one of the first times where we get all brand conscious of, I don't want the Sputnik one, or the AstraZ. It's very interesting. Maybe it belies a stronger understanding of our own health in the future. I'm not too sure. We've got 3 other people we haven't heard from. Maybe we can hear from quickly, and we'll try to quickly address the second topic around emotion. Keith, any thoughts in terms of just the cultural impact of what we've experienced?
No, I haven't thought too much about all this stuff. I've just been kind of doing my day-to-day and just kind of working on my own business and stuff. So I've been kind of, even though everything's been going on around me and lots of things in the news, I've just kind of been working away at my own stuff. So I haven't really paid a lot of attention to the cultural impact a whole lot.
Keith, where are you calling in from?
I'm calling in from Ontario. I'm just in the Durham region.
Cool. Wonderful. Well, good. All right. And then I'm not too sure if Alona, you're muted. I'm not too sure if you're comfortable mentioning the cultural impact in your part of the world. Hello. Oh, and you're muted as well. Sorry.
Multitasking, sorry. But really interesting conversation. I'm in Toronto also, but I have a lot of connections around the world, and it's a really interesting situation. Sorry. And also speaking to the Russian side, I have a lot of, I was born in the Soviet Union, came to Canada when I was 10, And so now I have a lot of Russian contacts, and the things I'm hearing from both, like the lack of reporting, all the numbers you're hearing from Russia are completely unbelievable. And I have a lot of also Russian community here that are very much, against. I think the lack of trust in the infrastructure and the government is a very, very significant impact. That's probably why those numbers are so low. Nobody's ever believed anything the government has told them. And I think those immigrants who came to around the world are carrying that with them. And it's a really hard thing to change, human mental models of trust and lack of trust. And I think that's just going to propagate. And it's just a really interesting conversation. So I'm lucky enough to be double vaccinated, but it's been really hard in Canada to get them. I see all my American colleagues getting, we call them free pass, people taking trips to Florida to get vaccinated and coming back. So it's, the inequality is really scary. And hearing Uruguayan colleagues, oh my God, I am feeling for you. I love Uruguay and Argentina, a lot of connections there. It's really, this has been really unsettling to the whole world. But in the positive side, are we transitioning to the emotional part now? Would you like me to start that? Hold on. Augustine has something to answer.
Well, you brought up a really important concept, which is trust. And there have been some discussions about how a high trust society has gone through this, or traditionally a high trust society, and are we becoming a lower trust society in the US as a result of the way we're reacting to things that have happened over, name your time period. But that's such an important concept that doesn't really get the public airing it deserves.
It is, it's interesting how trust can change quite quickly too, right? I think as Canadians, we were quite smug for about a year looking at our American colleagues who were having a rampant virus go through their population. And now that the US has reopened nearly everything up and we see full crowds in stadiums, and at least for a time period, they're ahead of us in terms of vaccinations. We're like, this is horrible. Who's at fault here? And we've seen it in political ratings and other things go down. So things can change quickly. Dave, you have, before we get to the emotional stuff, Ilona, and I'm glad you're about to wade in there, and I was going to just cut you off rudely there, and I would have apologized later. But Dave's last person here, he's an anchorman. He's usually got a good synthesis-driven mind. Maybe you can make sense of what we've heard and add your own flavor to it, Dave. And you may be muted.
I think I'm doing this. I'm still in divergence mode here, so bear with me for a second as I do kind of a little shotgunning. So I've got a brother living in Japan. I spent many years working with a large Japanese company. One of the slides that you put up, Sean, talked about how Japanese are among the most unhappy with their leadership, and also had early on the greatest expectations this was going to be a disaster. And I think those are both largely manifestations of culture. It's just that when I was a kid, I used to watch the Japanese monster movies all the time, Godzilla and Megalon and all that stuff, right? And it was argued that Japanese had all those monster movies because culturally they had been exposed to disasters over the course of thousands of years in their history. Earthquakes and tsunamis are kind of a given in that culture. And it's, nature rising up and just wiping us out, and then you get on to the next one. Really fascinating. And I think, I would suspect, I'm positing that is why the Japanese folks expected this to be an enormous disaster, because enormous disasters just sort of happen periodically there, and it's part of the culture. So your little stats there struck me. If you think about high trust societies, to Ilona's point, Japanese is one of the highest trust societies. And I think that when things are bad in a high trust society, you blame the society. Hey, you let me down. And I think that points to that sort of same view points to the causality for the leadership being dumped on, not to mention all the confusion about the Olympics, which we can sort of put in a separate category. So that was fascinating. Early on, when the virus was spreading rampantly, in North America, certainly in the States, and hardly anything in Japan, many of us were attributing that to culture as well, where part of America's power, frankly, is our go to hell, I'm going to do what I want. And that's an extremely powerful entrepreneurial perspective. You know, everyone tells me it'll never work, but I know it will, and I'm going to go do it, damn it. But that same perspective leads to, let's say, externalities of one's behavior, where I'm not going to wear a mask, I'm not going to socially isolate, whatever, right? So that's two sides. Whereas, of course, in Japan, to a much greater extent, people do what they're told to do and are better equipped for this kind of an emergency. I guess the only other thing I want to speak to culturally, and it's very North America centric, so I'll apologize in advance, but the politicization of the pandemic, I imagine it's got political flavors elsewhere, but nothing like, at least as far as I can tell, like in the US, where, you know, wearing a mask or not wearing a mask, and frankly, those are the only two options when you're out in public, are each perceived as a political act. It's like, what do? You can't not participate, not only in the politics, but in the divisive politics. So I think that the pandemic has forced people to make public statements about their political alignments, further polarizing an already polarized situation here in the US. And that to me has been fascinating. So again, not very synthetic, more shotgunny, but those are the thoughts that have been floating around in my mind during the conversation.
It's interesting, Dave. Like, I mean, we all know about the Republican versus Democratic polarization in the States, where more than half of the other side believes either the other side is immoral or at minimum is not listening at all to them. I'm wondering if it switched to the vaccinators versus the non-vaccinators, and there's maybe a little bit of a political skew shift where not everybody that was Republican is on one side of that thing, and not everybody that was Democratic is on one side. I'm not too sure if you've got a perspective on that.
Yeah, actually, there's studies on this. I'm a little out of date, maybe by a month or two, but it was I think it was a third of the Republicans were anti-vaxxers, and a smaller fraction of the Dems, but it wasn't strictly on party lines. And that said, the anti-vaxxers are waning as more and more people are reveling in their vaccinated status.
It shall be interesting when you can't get into a restaurant without a health passport, how much of the anti-vaxxer crew remains, right? Like just based on force of wanting to do something that they can't do.
One of my trackers on polarization these days is watching the T-shirt nation. So I think that people expose themselves that way. So I keep an eye on Red Button to see what kind of T-shirts are being bought and created. And as a favor to yourselves, just take a look at vaccination and use that search term on Red Button. Red Button does instances of one T-shirts. So these are emerging trends, but it is fascinating that people are wearing the Moderna logo as if it was Man United.
Not only a great insight, but also a great sense-making futurism way to spot early signals of the future. Do our T-shirts telegraph where our values are going? Probably, right? Yeah.
Actually, if I can throw out one more, post-World War II in America, the bomb won the war for us. At least that was the perception, right? It ended the war. And that led to an enormous belief in science. Scientists became elevated and we became a sort of pro-science culture, much more so than we had been before. And I just have to wonder if, I mean, science, the vaccine really flipped it here in the US. It was almost, I mean, in time scale, it was almost a toggle where the perspective on hopelessness switched to hope very quickly. And I sort of wonder if looking forward, we're going to see another resurgence of science and veneration of scientists as we did after the war when science saved us in that instance as well. So that's more of a predictive cultural question, I guess.
It's interesting, Dave. We write about the what's happened in the news of the last week in our Medium channel, Grey Swan Guild, and space exploration has flourished in every one of our last 6 news wraps. It's just like you cannot look at the news across the world without looking at space. So it may be a function of, science has really come out with a really good face out of this pandemic, and people are pivoting that to, God, like Elon and Elon and Jeff are going into space, and we love science, so we may be launching into a second era of space exploration interested people.
In today's round, the space is mentioned again.
Agustin is leading our news wrap today, so we're even lucky to have him here, because every week one of us takes about 6 hours of our time to actually produce this thing, and so he's doing it as we speak, probably. All right.
People enjoyed being stuck at home so much that they're now fantasizing about spending 2 years in a tin can on the way to another planet.
It's true.
Welcome to my tiny home in space.
I gotta think there's got to be a Netflix show of like the entrepreneur who thought Mars was a really cool place to be, and then goes stir crazy in his little cocoon in Mars. It's
well, I really wanted to run a longitudinal experiment on the long-term effects of both claustrophobia and agoraphobia simultaneously.
Yeah, that would be it. All right, we don't have much time, but I'd love to pivot around the room one more time, and maybe we can do this in a 30-second soundbite for each of us. We've talked about culture, and it's kind of being more around kind of national or regional type of concerns and culture impacts. I guess we want to get maybe a little bit more personal in terms of what has been the emotional impact of what we've experienced here. Like and oftentimes when it's emotional, it's personal. So I'm not too sure. Alona, you were all chomping at the bit like a horse in the gates, ready to go on that one. So do you want to start us off?
Yeah, I'm happy to report that I've spent more time this year with family than I ever would have ever. I have grown children between ages of 26 to 30, and we have 7 people in the house every weekend. And we like have family movie nights, and we do walks, and that would never ever have happened. Like I wouldn't be here, they wouldn't be here. It's like this forced kind of community, which is really cool. On the negative side, I have a husband who's a psychiatrist. We never see him. They are way off the scale of overworked and underpaid and underappreciated, and it's just insane. So that's my piece.
That is a great way to kick us off on both fronts. I'm glad you shared that. Thank you.
Alon, I have a question just to follow on, Sean. Sorry. When do you think that the stats and data will emerge on mental health, like facts? We've been having a hard time tracking like terrible, dark things like suicide and deep mental health issues and violence. And I want to have the data to find these things out, because I know there's an imbalance, even in your story, between the positive family, that support system building out, that's healthy. And then the negative side as well. But I need to see, when do you think the data will emerge? How long will that take, do you think, in your opinion?
Do you think, when is he going to do all his reports? Years, we're talking years. And I mean, I just heard that there's like doctors leaving the practice because, there's just too much. It's really, it's overload on every channel. So this system cannot continue. And everybody wants to get mental health assistance remotely, virtually. Where are we going to get all those people who are going to support it? We can't, your machine learning is not going to help, it's a very serious problem. We cannot scale. I have a daughter who just graduated medical school, during the pandemic, which was a really interesting experience also, and went into it's the hospitals to do it's a scary time to be in this space, and we need more need is expanding, and there's no way we can produce enough to fill the needs.
Big time.
It's a 30-year investment to get, from zero to having somebody ready to help.
Now, I haven't called on you a while because I also have the same reservation about the pronunciation of your first name. So it's like when you have that, it's like this reluctant, I need to call back on.
Heis.
Okay. Jeez, I just cannot phonetically get there. But you started us off so well, and we haven't got back to you since. So let's, how about your emotional impact?
It was interesting for me. I was one of the fortunate first 490,000 people that got vaccinated in South Africa. And why I say fortunate, it was first ring-fenced for medical professionals. And I'm registered as an industrial psychologist, so I could get access to the vaccine. But just knowing that I'm not at the forefront, and maybe at a second tier, it's definitely one of the things that you say am I really worth it? Shouldn't somebody else get the opportunity first? And I think my wife had COVID last week, and for her, the big feedback is things like survivor guilt in terms of who she's been in contact with. Could she have been a carrier of, you can call it death? You don't know what's the ripple effect of it. So I think definitely the points raised in the chat in terms of PSD, in terms of what's the impact, but I think more it is on a higher level. I think maybe a greater care, a raised level of I think consciousness around impact towards other people. I see that even with my son going to school, and people more in tune with that, which I think wouldn't have been the case. So I think even in a workplace where we have more frequent check-ins, so people naturally more attuned to actually be curious about people's well-being. So I think definitely there's also been a positive spillover, although there's been distancing, and but I think in terms of that is an emotional component that creates a heightened level of self-awareness.
Wonderful. Wow. Like such raw and quite current reactions to what's going on. It's so interesting. In no particular order, and we'll ask for maybe 30 seconds now, just because we'll go way over time. Just kind of like your most important emotional impact. I'll go in alphabetical order. Agustin, what's your emotional sentiment?
Hope, because projecting that for next year or a few more, then that's my screen. I think that we can really come back together as humanity, like with hope in a way, right? Like that this was a reset point and we can actually see forward and past and change some of the habits that we mark the first commencement of the 21st century. That.
Wonderful. That word reset's an interesting one too. Yeah. Bruce.
I think emotionally, one of the models we've been creating and looking at is called the hierarchical needs of an economic viable society. It sounds like a thesis, but it looks at the emotional, physical, and social needs of a society before it can be independent and self-serving. And it's looking at those emotional things. I think there's been a huge collapse emotionally because of trauma and because of mistrust and because of just the circumstances of isolation and confinement. And I think we've got a huge amount of work to do that is yet to be discovered or realized. And I think people are hurting a lot more. We almost got a kind of a Vietnam War that's happening, and the fallout is going to be long-lived with us. And I think it's not about the vaccination. It's not about that. It's definitely we're going to swing over. We've seen the financial crisis. I think we're going to fall hugely into a pit of emotional crisis on a global scale because of this. And I don't think we've even begun to peer over that edge yet.
I'm inclined to agree with you. Although having said that, there is a theory out there that the Spanish flu and World War I caused the Roaring *20s to happen, and there was probably some stigmas and social, mental and health stigmas there. But anyway, I said I want to be quick, so thank you, Bruce. That was quite interesting, and that term needs an acronym. I won't remember the full word of that term. So, Dave, your thoughts?
Gosh, I just feel like the gain has been turned up on my emotion. And I don't know if that's because I've lost the capacity to emotionally regulate because I'm not actually in people's company as much, at least outside of immediate family, or if the world is pushing me harder in both directions, right? Despair as you look at the numbers of people that are dying and the misery in which they're dying, and hope at humanity's power to overcome in various ways. So, Yeah, I just feel like the gain has been turned up, and I can imagine, as with many systems, when the gain gets turned up, too high, things break, right? You blow out the speakers in your stereo or whatever. So that may speak to the long-term damage that this does, if you can extend the metaphor that far. But that's where I'm at. I'm like getting whiplashed all over the place, and it's exhausting.
Wow.
But I'll leave it there.
Wonderful, Dave, as always. Joseph.
Yes, yes. So, the main emotions I have, and most of my friends and people in my circle, is gratitude and urgency. So gratitude on the fact that we have a beautiful beach here in Mauritius, and when you're locked down after 2 months, you go out, you then appreciate what it is. So we now have we have more appreciation on being alive, seeing friends, having lunch, going to a restaurant, enjoying the beach, breathing clean air and all that. And also we have like a sense of urgency of I had this when we had the first lockdown and things were so looked grim. And the idea was, what if I die in the next, 16 weeks? And, in Mauritius, death is not due to COVID. Death is due to lack of supply of food and other amenities, right? Because we're an island and we don't produce much. We export a lot from South Africa. So if you think of a zombie scenario, the fear was, what if this is it? So then most of us had, this sense of urgency. We still have it, of doing a lot, within a shorter period of time. So if we had things that we had planned to do in the next 5 years, so now we've already done them, just in case, death comes, before our expected time. So we have those two things, gratitude and the sense of urgency.
Wonderful, Joseph. That was really good. And you've demystified something. I always thought to myself, when the zombies come to Earth, that I could go to Mauritius because it's an island. You've told me maybe that's not an approach.
Yeah, that's a bad idea.
Sorry, I probably crossed over James alphabetically. I apologize, James.
No worries. Yeah, my personal emotionally, I'm a pretty stable guy for the most part, and it's been sort of even keel. So for me, it's been more the observation of just the emotional spectrum for people and the intensity and the rapidity of highs and lows in people that you don't normally see that kind of variation so quickly. And it's interesting, some of the topics that people brought up, where I've seen sort of both sides. So, my wife is a large US based multinational, and, there's leadership in that organization that you definitely want people back in the office and get them there and other stuff. And she, as well as many of the people that she interacts with, are like, we never want to go back, right? We love working from home. We're now living further away. We've changed our commute. On the flip side of that, I have a daughter who's now working at Shopify. Part of the reason she loved Shopify and wanted to join at the time was their offices, their interaction. There's so many people. She gets to meet new friends, and it becomes part of the cultural norm, and which many people, even older people that have been at places, a lot of your community has been based on sort of where you worked. Shopify is talking about never going back to the office. Now everyone's going to work from, and there's a huge disappointment. So you see people potentially moving with their feet and different jobs from both ends of the spectrum. And it's sort of back to like, it's almost back to like nobody knows, right? Like nobody knows the solution. Nobody knows the right path forward. A lot of people seem to want to make it black and white. And I think a lot of people are going to have to really grasp with a better feeling of the grayness and the flexibility that might be required to balance these things out. I find it goes back to even the government changes in what they've done. It's like, oh, we have a lockdown. Well, people hate the lockdown. Some people love the lockdown. They think it's the right thing to do. As soon as there's an easing of the lockdown, it's amazing how many people jump to go and do the things the government now says they're allowed to do, whether it's a good idea or not a good idea. We lock down, we stabilize. We start to open things up, we spike. The government letting us do things to the detriment of what our healthcare professionals may be telling us is the right or wrong things to do. And back to people just need to balance and better understand the variability and the need to balance between what they're allowed to do, what they should do, what they shouldn't. and it's tough to sort of rely on political leaders to look after your healthcare needs in strange situations like this. You really don't know who to trust, and even back to magnifying, like in some ways I look at it's even helped the pluses and minuses of different political organizations. You look at communist rule in China. You want to lock down a city, boom, done overnight. Everything's locked down. You want to make everybody vaccinated, boom, done, make it happen. Like there's no choice, right? Which in the grand scheme of a political society that's for everyone, you maybe think, well, maybe overall they're doing a lot of the right things. Now, the way they do it may be wrong. And then you look at North American society where, you've just got people fighting, kicking and screaming when the vast majority realizes what they're doing is with everybody's best interests in mind, right? Long term, if we want to be healthy, sometimes you need to clamp down, but it's just interesting to see the perspectives, and it'll be a long time before we know the outcomes of what's worked, what hasn't worked, what the psychological outcomes have been to the mental state of the broader population of people. I think there's so much that we're just not going to know for such a long time from different countries, different cultures, different aspects of even within our smaller communities. It's challenging and certainly interesting times, but the sooner we get out of this, the better for everyone. Although I keep wondering, is it really going to, how quickly is that really going to happen? Because every time we start to loosen the reins, we see the cases go back up.
Great insights, great enthusiasm, and thank you for the small plug of the gray as well. We concur with you that it isn't black and white; it is many shades of gray. Keith, emotional impact, and let's keep it tight, I suppose.
Yeah, I suppose I'm the poster boy for emotional impact for COVID, barring that I haven't lost any weight to COVID. Yeah, so my life completely changed during COVID. I separated from my wife early on in COVID. I changed jobs early on in COVID. I kicked off to bootstrap a company early on in COVID. I have two daughters, one in high school. It's her last year of high school, which is a critical time socially for kids in high school, in their life, basically, for just being with their friends and stuff. And I have a younger daughter as well in school. So navigating all that during COVID's been extremely tough, because when lockdown happens and you're losing your breaks, right? Your entertainment, your things to do, your social pieces that give you a break from all the other stuff going on in your life just isn't there anymore. So I think we find solace in a lot of outdoor exercise, just having the ones closest to us support us when we need it. I think that's been the saving grace in the whole thing. I think I agree with Augustine that hope is a big part of this. Gratitude is also a big part of this, Joseph. I believe that as well. But yeah, so that's been my experience. It's been very difficult, but having all those good things and looking towards the good things in life, it just kind of gets you through it all.
Wow, Keith, great share, by the way. Yeah. Wow, I got nothing more to say. That's thank you for sharing that. Louise.
Yeah, it's been emotional, which is really bizarre because I'm not a terribly up and down kind of emotional. I'm kind of an even keel kind of person, and I've always found it pretty easy to, I don't stay angry long or frustrated or irritated. It's like, okay, fine, it's done, let's move on. And I guess working with clients over this last year, 18 months, and actually helping other people, being of service to others, has been enormously helpful, because it's allowed me to process what I'm going through at the same time, which sounds a little bizarre, but clearly it's not something I put on the table in coaching sessions, but it's something that I'm processing subconsciously, consciously as well. I think the big picture for me is we are all inextricably changed forever. And that I completely accept. And bizarrely, from a very personal perspective, I knew I needed to change, or I thought things needed to change. And I knew it was me fundamentally at the core of it that needed to change in order for things that needed to change. And I've changed. And I don't know what the outcome of this will be. For myself, for others. But one thing I do know is that I've really shifted from my head to my heart. in a way that, you know, perhaps I've been employing all sorts of other slightly more woo-woo practices to work on over the years. And boy, did it happen in the last year or so. So compassion right to the fore. I see myself and others everywhere. Any sense of being anything other than one energetic whole has disappeared, and separateness, or, you know, identities, and, you know, all of that stuff is just, for me, just feels like surface nonsense, and I don't have a lot of time for it. So that deep connection, that deep understanding, that deep acknowledgement of the other, I guess is reflected in that acknowledgement I have of my own feelings through this time, and accepting them all and not judging any of them. And yeah, just, you know, we're walking this road together. I don't know if anybody noticed this week, but there was a fantastic, I forget what they call it, America's Got Talent, perhaps Britain's Got Talent. There was a golden buzzer moment with Simon Cowell for a young woman by the name of Nightbird, who has cancer, and how she's spent this last year. And there's a quote going around on social and digital media, which I think has just profoundly impacted so many people because everybody's sharing it. And that little quote is, and if you haven't seen it, watch it. It definitely brought a lump to my throat. You can't wait until life isn't hard anymore before you decide to be happy. And that was, you know, quite profound for me. And it's something that I'll carry with me. So that's me, I'm done.
Wow, thank you for sharing that, Louise. A lot of things I share, and it's interesting. Nathan's next, and I was on a call with Nathan just a couple days ago, or maybe last week, and I think he brought up the America's Got Talent exact same type of thing. But Nathan, emotional impact?
I think the overwhelming thing has been isolation, and also being cooped up because my wife's working from home, and although I have this lovely home office, I have to share it for the first time. And I've already gotten the question of when is this going to end so she can get some work done, which is a challenge because I need a lot more of this. And so in terms of impact, this was a year I needed to get out more and interact with more people at the meetups. But at the same time, I've gotten so much out of things like this because here I am talking with a group of people that I would not have met at the local meetup. And frankly, more interesting topics. Because the things I find interesting, you've got to kind of have to scour the entire world to find the tiny percentage of the populations that finds these things interesting. So that's been a great upside. I think my concern, and this is on along the lines of the black and white versus gray, is I'm feeling a lot of tension over certainty versus uncertainty. And in particular, people's certainty about how things are going is fueling my uncertainty about how things are going. Everyone is so sure we're ready for the next chapter, that things are over and normal. We're going to argue about, it's like, well, and my continuing refrain is, well, what if it's not over? Because if you look around the world, it's not over. I noticed that the current cases in South Africa are on the upslope for what looks like a third wave. So this is not over. And as long as it's somewhere on the planet, it's a threat to humanity. Even if the current vaccines are effective against current variants, but this is a living thing that's going to continue to evolve, and it's probably just a matter of time until we get one that can evade the vaccines. And then the question will be, how bad is that one? We don't know. There's no answer, right? It could be worse, it could be less bad, and we just don't know. But I'm also concerned that we're burning out our ability to handle big problems. I saw a chart yesterday out of the UK about a zero carbon 2050 plan and what that meant across sectors. And it's a very interesting, it's like a dozen bars that go across time and represent how big a sector gets over time. And it shows aviation trending to zero by 2050, shipping trending to zero by 2050, and then maybe coming back as other technologies come online later in the century. And I'm looking at it thinking, that's my entire lifetime. And we've shown that faced with a global pandemic, don't handle it all that well. We get political, faced with a non-human enemy, we make enemies of other humans. And we can't wait to declare the emergency over whether it is or not. Doesn't bode well for, we need to change fundamentals of our economy and the way of living for all of humanity if we want to maintain a livable climate. And we only have 30 years, 30 years to make incredibly disruptive changes. Kind of tells me we don't have the capacity to think that way. So that's kind of where I am. I've always been the, look at all of the trends, all of the, if you look at all the futurists and they predict lots of different things, or they make scenarios that consider lots of things. And scenarios are the art of predicting, not predicting, but anticipating multiple possible futures. But in the real timeline, all futures are only one. And all of those trends have to come back to take place in the same universe. And so I look at how all of these things might have to take place on the same planet. And I don't think we have the capacity to do that. And I think we've seen that we have less capacity maybe than we did before, or else maybe we've revealed it.
Good sobering perspective, Nathan. I think in a previous meeting you said, I need to be the designated pessimist of the
No,
guild.
I said I don't want to be the designated pessimist, but it does seem to be something I'm good at.
I know. I think it's good, sobering, longer term perspective. Rob, and I'm going to pivot to Prashant. Prashant, we're talking about the emotional pandemic from the pandemic, so the emotional impact. Rob, your thoughts, and let's see if we can close this out in just a couple of minutes.
Yeah, no
gentlemen.
problem. Thank you, first of all, everyone. Thank you, Gijs. Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Louise. I honor your presence here. Dave, James, Keith, Ilona. It's been too long since we've seen each other, and I want to see you again soon. Nathan, you're new to me, and Joseph too. That's great. Prashant, my brother Bora, and Bruce. Thank you all. Now, on serious things, concerning emotion, like I know from past experience, past studies, past analysis and research that this is one of the greatest traumas for everybody on Earth. It has signs of trauma, period. Dave, when you mentioned that things seem more extreme everywhere, that's a symptom of someone who's going through trauma. Emotions go high. Love goes high. What you like, you really like. What you hate, you really hate. There is that kind of thing that happens. It's a symptom. If you enjoyed the beach, Joseph, if you enjoyed the sky more than you did last year or 2 years ago, that's a symptom of someone going through a trauma, that you see colors differently, you taste differently. This is well studied across hundreds of years. Even Freud noticed it and made mistakes when he called it all hysteria. It comes back over and over, but these are symptoms that we talk about. They're very important. That's what I think about. So when I know and feel I'm experiencing a trauma, or one of my friends or others, I stop and listen to the right side of my brain, because it's a survival technique. It's what we remember hard. We remember differently. If you hear anyone talking about last year on March 20th when the pandemic was announced, or you hear anyone talking about what happened to their grandparents in an LTC, and if they say the simple line, it was like a movie. As soon as you hear that person who's telling that story, not the grandmother or grandfather, but that person is exhibiting a symptom of deep trauma. You remember things differently in your brain. You remember trauma in your amygdala. You do not remember it in other places. It's a separate form of memory. It's a survival technique. It's why we remember monsters. It's a different memory. So my first worry and concern that I knew this was a trauma was I was worried about my kids. That's what I'm worried about all the time. That's my biggest emotion. Are my children going to achieve some kind of happiness and stability? I feel confident about that now because of certain responses. I worry about trauma now for the next 10 years, and I hope it gets studied well. And I'm here to serve, and hopefully the guild is here to serve in that. But the biggest emotion, negative one, is about death and trauma. Positive, all-around hope and youth. I don't want to listen to stodgy people that don't want to change their mind, stodgy people that don't want to deal with uncertainty. And I get so frustrated in that stuck mire of mud and cake that I turn to the youth. and I want to put more and more and more of my time into youth. I'm literally giving up on sections of the world and their responses because I can't do anything about that. Hopefully we can all just give a gift to the next generation, give a gift of a planet to the next generation, and watch the gray swans. They're coming.
Wonderful, Rob. This had the idea of exploring culture around the world, and it's taken on almost an emotional octave. This one too. I agree with Louise. Certainly with some of your stuff you share. I'm Spock at the best of times, but you've risen my level of heartness in my throat to a level of not quite tears yet. I'm not crying. All right. Anyway. Prashant, you're laughing, you're putting your thumbs up. It probably strikes me as a good time to at least get you to weigh in on your emotional impact during this pandemic. What do you think, Prashant? And where are you calling in from too?
I'm calling from Brazil. Sorry for coming in late, but I think it seems like the documentary in Netflix of the octopus, where the person who is talking about the octopus looks at the ocean as a forest that he can enter at any point that he chooses to. And he talks about how he deals with the coldness of his experience. And this is precisely what probably the planet is experiencing, the coldness of the virus. And this is something which is unseen. So how much ever we rationalize and intellectualize, and we look through the lens of vaccine, we look through the lens of I mean, there is no limit to how many lenses we can look at what is happening right now. So if we have to choose in this moment, the way I see it is through the lens of I seem to be quite obsessed about this, while a part of my the thought process is trying to squeeze in post-materialism paradigm about consciousness and all that. So I will just take you into this conversation on consciousness. You see, so there seems to be this consciousness, and it is playing out in multiple different ways. So the most comfortable way in which we can see consciousness is probably through science. We are close to University College London. We have the best brains that have this creation has flourished, and they are all together. They flock together. So Carl Friston and Dr. James Cook, I think, if we can invite them to do some dance with science and consciousness and this, I think they will really give us a view that is agnostic everything. I mean, if you force it into a category, you will experience some emotion, and probably that is the way it needs to work. I still don't know how to unpack, how much time is needed to unpack, and where is this going? What are the archetypes we are playing with? Is this all a dance of archetypes? Is existence happening at various levels? I mean, one at the physical level. So as we traverse this journey of emotions subjectively, and if we force an objective expression of it in a forum like this, what are the words it needs to use? Like words like what? Like archetypes? What is it? I mean, so we know, even to say that we know what we are going towards is kind of violence, you see, is wanting to know itself seems to be some kind of a violent act. So this is one level of struggle, how to reconcile consciousness, surrender, free will, and of course, I mean, emotion is needed. This is the force of life, which is making this conversation happen. You see,
Sean, you bring up as many good questions as you do insights as well. But I think you mentioned time in your treatise as well, and time is getting the better of us. It's the time is our biggest enemy here. We have to, I think we had an expectation we might have had a shorter one, but we always do this because it's such interesting and good exchange and interaction. I've got just a couple of housekeeping things to mention here before we go off, but I would ask our panelists if they would be interested in writing to what they have just talked about today. If I sent out a message to you, my hope is if you can put in chat whether or not, just mentioned yes, I'm in or something in the chat, and I will definitely follow up with you. I think I have most of your emails. Dave is chaperoning us next week, June 16th at 7 p.m. Eastern time, whatever that means in your world. Dave, do you want to give the 10-second thought in terms of our next salon?
Sure, and actually it's closely allied to the discussion that we've just been having. It occurred to me that we have all been transformed by this experience, hopefully in better ways as well as worse. And if we could share the transformations that we've undergone and learn from each other, that would be a great thing. And we've done that a little bit today, hopefully more on Wednesday. The structure is brief introduction, then we split into breakout rooms of 4 or 5 people in a room, have pretty intense, intimate conversations, potentially around the topic, but not necessarily. Come back, each group briefly reports to the broader collection some of the key ideas that occurred, and that's it. As Sean pointed out earlier, there's no specific output. It's intended to be a transformational experience rather than a sort of specifically concretely productive one. And all you guys have been super interesting. We'd love to have you join us on Wednesday.
And as Dave mentioned, and I will concur, there has never been a bad salon. They've all been amazing with a lot of revelations. We do have 2 future ateliers for the summer, July 9th and August 13th. One is on tech swans. The next one is on future of work mastery. These were number 1 and 2 in terms of voting, in terms of what we should do as ateliers. So we've also got a fall program that we'll serve up as well. So as mentioned, if you're interested in writing about this, we're trying to create different artifacts around what we do in these ateliers. My quickie in terms of, I guess I was asked, so I was last in line here. My quickie is, as much as I've learned a lot and reappraised a lot during this pandemic, I've seen enough of getting out of COVID and like being in our quarantine stage. I treasure so much more the real lifeness of certain things. Like for me, it's Friday, 5:30, a frosty mug with a beer in it, with 6 of my best friends or any friends, and some social collisions of new people, and having what the Irish call the crack. Just this feeling of conviviality and fun that I just, as much as I love all of you on Zoom, I just cannot capture it on here. That's maybe what I'm experiencing. I'm gonna go around the room. We're gonna do this. We're gonna be disciplined about this too. I've completely valued this time together. My hope is people watching this online will also capture the zeitgeist and sentiment. One word, and only one word, don't cheat on this one, that encapsulates your thoughts from our experience today. We will go to His. Have I said it right? Oh, I hope so.
Gijs, anticipation.
What's the one word?
I would say anticipation.
Anticipation. Wonderful. Rob?
Serendipity.
Wonderful. Joseph?
Gratitude.
Nice. Bruce?
Optimistic.
Awesome. Louise?
Enlightening.
Wonderful. Dave?
Transformation.
Wow. Good. James?
Spectrum.
Interesting word. I like it. Nathan?
Connection.
Yeah. Augustine?
Community.
Community. Keith? And you're muted. Just
I liked enlightenment, but I'll take faith.
wow. Good. No duplicates yet. Let's see if Prashant changes this. Prashant, word, and you're muted as well. Yep.
Purposeless.
All right. Purposeness?
No purpose.
No,
Purposeless.
purposeless.
Well done, Zen.
In some forms, that might be a critique of what we're doing. I think that was a compliment, so that's good. I will go with honored. Honored to have all of you here. I'm going to stop recording now. Thank you all at home that have joined us on this one, and we can have a couple of minutes afterward on just talking about this. But